I want to welcome folks back to another one of our Zoom interviews. And today we have a very exciting guest, Larry Ross. Welcome, Larry.
Morning, Dave.
How are you?
I'm doing wonderful.
And where are you coming to us from today?
I'm coming to you from Oaks Pond here in Skowhegan. My wife Rebecca and I, we live at our camp a good part of the year here now in Skowhegan, and at our camp, and then the rest of the time we're the dreaded snowbird. We go down to Florida in the winter.
Very good. Well, you are one of the most amazing people that I have ever met. The things that you do are unbelievable. If I were to tell people without having you to explain them and without having some slides to actually confirm them, people probably wouldn't believe the types of things that you have done. And I look forward to exploring that with you. And you are such an amazing person that I've realized I can't squeeze you into one 30-minute episode. So we're going to have to do a couple of interviews with you. I first met you because you were a teacher, an Enrichment Resources Teacher at the Margaret Chase Smith School in Skowhegan. How long did you have that position, and what years?
10 years. I did that job from 2000, September of 2001, and 10 years later I had left in, would be June of 2011, I believe. But it was 10 years. It was a 10-year span. It was a second career for me.
Mm-hmm.
I had worked as an executive director of a nonprofit working with adults with developmental disabilities for a number of years, and retired from that with the idea that I wanted to teach. And I had the good fortune to land a job at, as you described, working in the Enrichment Resource Program at the Margaret Chase Smith School.
Very good. So you are a master storyteller, and I was trying to figure out, well, how do I introduce Larry Ross? And I started going through my photos of some of our interactions over the years. I'm going to do a share screen right now, and I think I found someone had summed you up. Can you see this photo?
Oh yeah.
You see, it's a flag. I think it's a flag on the side of your barn.
Yes, no, actually that's the side on the crate. That's
on the crate. Okay. Well, we'll be talking about the crate. We'll get to the crate eventually. Do you see the first line and the first red stripe?
I do.
Mr. Ross is nuts.
Mr. Ross is nuts. Right. Right.
Can you give us some context of what the flag and what that means?
What that means? That flag was a summation of a student, and Mr. Ross is not only nuts, but his long-term memory has a little time to click into gear. If you give me a second, I'll remember her name.
Okay.
But it was a young lady that when we took trips on down to Washington D.C. and the students had to bring back a project. They had to produce a project.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a student's project, and it really does sum up, if just looking at it for me, just looking at some of the things on there. Mr. Ross is nuts. I'm an enthusiastic guy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an enthusiastic guy, and my enthusiasm spills out in a lot of different ways. And for 5th and 6th grade kids, it spills out in good ways, I think, for the most part. It's one of the things that I would teach students, that I would try to instill in them, is the idea that you have to get good at looking around at the world and recognizing what has value and what doesn't have value. And the expression I use for that is respond with wonderment and awe.
Mm-hmm.
You can develop the habit when you see something that you look for things, but you look with a sense that you should have a sense of wonderment about what you see.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's represented in Mr. Ross's nuts, because, like, to me, I would be very excited and enthusiastic about witnessing things and sharing things with students and turning them on, and I can see it.
Yeah. Well, you have that ability to not only help kids see that, but even for me as an adult interacting, you make the world around you one of wonderment and awe by the way you interact with the world. So the next line down is really, I want to focus, because what you would do every year is you'd bring some students over to the Margaret Chase Smith Library and talk about projects they were working on. And the second line of the flag says, Sweet Pea Aubin was killed the first day of the war. And so I'm going to go to the next photo so that they can see a picture of J. Aubin, and you can start to tell his story.
Yeah. It's for me, I went to work at the Margaret Chase Smith School on September of 2001.
Yeah, it just dawned on me the significance of that.
Yeah. And when
a week later, the world changed.
That's right. And when I got this job, it was something, I had the good fortune of landing this job, but I wasn't exactly sure that I could do it. I had no idea really what I was doing and what I was getting my way into. I had kind of managed to work my way into a position that was probably way beyond my pay grade, as they would say, and way beyond what I had already demonstrated I was capable of doing. Mr. Jim Ramsey, who was the director of the program, I think saw my potential and gave me an opportunity. But I can remember the first week of school, I was literally sick at the end of every day because I didn't feel like I didn't know what I was doing. Mm-hmm. And I remember the morning of September 11th happened to be the first day that I conducted a class with my students. I would have students come and go during the course of the day, and I conducted this class, and I felt like I might be able to do this. I suddenly had a sense that maybe I can pull this off. And I went down to a room of a teacher that was my mentor, and I walked into the room, and I saw this scene projected on a television in front of the room, and I thought, why are they watching a movie in the middle of the day? What's this movie that they're watching? And it was the World Trade Center engulfed in smoke. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden I realized there's something real happening here. That framed almost my entire career, the impact that 9/11 had on this nation, continues to have on this nation. Mm-hmm. Well, obviously after 9/11, a couple of years go by, and suddenly in March of 2003, the war has begun. The war in Iraq has begun. Mm-hmm. And driving home from work that night, I heard on the news that there had been, the first casualty was reported. And they didn't know who it was. They didn't release the names. And I went into school and I said to my students, the first casualty of the war has been announced. And one of the kids said, is it our Marine? Is it our Marine? And my class the year before, in honor of 9/11, had sent a 30 by 50 foot flag across the United States on the first anniversary of 9/11. And we were on the summit of Cadillac Mountain at sunrise on the first anniversary of 9/11. And we got it out to California, across the country in one day. And we sent it to a Marine in California that I didn't know, that I had never met, but he had lost his best friend on 9/11. And we sent it to him. And he met with another school on the beach in San Diego at sunset. And the kids called their project Sea to Shining Sea. Mm-hmm. And the flag went from Maine to California in one day to this other Marine. And the kids all came into school and said, was it our Marine captain that was killed? And I said, it wasn't. It wasn't your Marine captain, but it was somebody's Marine captain. And just imagine what it's like for that family today. And then the next day, the paper came out, and it had a picture of J. Aubin on the cover, who was a young man that went to the Margaret Chase Smith School as a kid. And you could look up in the 6th grade yearbook where he talked about wanted to become a pilot. And he was among the first day's casualties. And I asked my students, I said, why don't you research this young man just to see what you can learn of him? And they did. At the time, they just knew him as Major J. Aubin, but when they researched him, they learned that his call sign in the Marine Corps was Sweet Pea, because in the words of his friends, he always had to be so damn nice. And on the second day of the war, a young man was killed from San Diego. And I said to my students, I heard his aunt being interviewed on the radio. And I said, why don't you learn about this kid? And they did. And they said, look at that, Mr. Ross. It's just like our flag, from Sea to Shining Sea. Thomas Mullen Adams a descendant of President John Adams, valedictorian of his class, a United States Naval Academy graduate who was in the an exchange officer with the Royal Navy, and he had been killed on the second day of the war. And the kids remarked that that was just like our flag, sea to sea. It encompassed the entire country.
Skowhegan, Maine to San Diego, California.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the kids, they did up these biographies of these two men. And I said, why don't you send them to the families and tell them what you've learned? And they did. And I didn't know either of the families. We found addresses and we sent them to the families. And I got an email back from Thomas Mullen Adams' dad out in San Diego. And he said, you know a lot about these two boys, but here's what you don't know. And he attached a photograph for me. And the photograph was two graves at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in San Diego, right beside each other. And it was the grave of J. Aubin from Skowhegan and Thomas Adams from San Diego. They had been buried together, buried side by side, just by a fluke or a coincidence, you would say, or a twist of fate, however you want to describe it. And for these kids at that time, this picture is probably a couple of years after. This is maybe 2006, 2007.
Yeah, in the lower right-hand corner, it's dated, timestamp 2006.
2006. Well, for these kids, that story remained a part of, for me, both these men were examples of just wonderful people that had ambitions, that had dreams, that had things that they wanted to achieve, that were known for their accomplishments. But the way Stephen Covey defines it is trustworthiness is a characteristic that only comes out of character and competence. And when you meet people of character and competence, you should respond with wonderment and awe. Mm-hmm. And you should look at them and you should say, how did they do this and how can I do that? That was the way that I like to describe my job to students was to tell them not what to think, but how to think. Mm-hmm. And to me, the foundation of how to think is being a trustworthy person, being a person of character and competence, and you build on those two things. Mm-hmm. And Jay and Tom did that. And these kids sent that information out to those families. And the father wrote back to me from California and he said, this is wonderful. He said, we're not going to decorate our son's grave. We decorate the space between our son's grave and Sweet Pea's grave, because Sweet Pea's mom is never going to be here to decorate his grave. So he's the lads, as Mr. Adams referred to it. The lads are our responsibility now. And when Jay's family went out to California for the very first time to visit his grave, they went with the Adams family, and the Adams family had them back to their home for a big dinner and sent me a photograph of that. And to be able to go to these kids and say, look what you made happen. Look what you made happen for these families. And their worst of times, you provided them a connection, mm-hmm. a connection. Yeah. And so this Haley Holt is the young lady holding that portrait of Jay. And that portrait of Jay is made up of thousands of thumbprint pictures taken from the Washington Post website, The Faces of the Fallen. It's pixelated, obviously, and each one of those dark and white and lighter and grayer pictures is an image of another person that was lost in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay. And Haley made that with photocopier and scissors. Yeah. Paper. Yeah.
So yeah, I want people to be able to see that image of Jay, and it's something that one of your students produced, and then you've touched upon another. I think this is a different year. This is this is 2004, and these are 4 students with a headstone, which you can see towards the bottom of the picture, and I'll give a better picture of the headstone right here.
Right.
Which ties together what you were just talking about.
Sure. Go back to the second picture, the first picture, if you don't mind for a second. Yes, this is stone, but there's two stones there. There's two boxes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's two boxes. It's tough. Everything is a story with me.
I know. I know. I
This,
could go hours. As I say, I could go hours and hours. You've got so many stories, so many great
this
stories.
two stones there.
Yeah.
There's two stones there because I have a little aviation museum in my backyard that we'll talk about later. And I wanted to commemorate, these guys were both aviators, and my students had done this project. And I went to Herb LePage at the Page Memorials in Skowhegan here, up on the Eaton Mountain Road, the Eaton Mountain Road. And I asked him, I wanted him to make a stone, and I described what I wanted: a map of the United States with a star for Maine and a star for San Diego. And I said I wanted to put Major J. Aubin on it, Lieutenant Tom Adams from Sea to Shining Sea. And Herb said, yeah, we'll do that. And I said, can the kids come up and watch when you make the stone? And that kind of took him aback a little bit. And he said, okay. And I told him I wanted the stone on a piece of white marble, similar to the white marble stones as they are at Fort Rosecrans and at Arlington National Cemetery. And he said, yeah, we'll do that. And we went up and we watched him make this pattern that you see on this granite stone on a marble stone.
Mm-hmm.
And as we were watching him make it, he was about 3/4 of the way done, and I saw him do a little flinch. But I didn't pay much attention to it. We got all done. I said, well, can I take the stone with me? And he said, no. He says, you come back in 2 days and get it. I'll have it done then. And so the marble stone is the stone on the right in this photograph. 2 days later, I came back and there was this granite stone done.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, wait a minute, where's the marble stone? He says, I made a mistake. I messed it up. And I said, well, can I see it? And he said, yeah. Well, I looked at the stone and I looked closely. And it took me about a minute to realize that one of the A's in Thomas's name, the cross in the A was blemished. It had a little bit of an extra blip in it where he had carved it, where it had been sandblasted out. It was a flaw. Mm-hmm. And he said, I want it to be perfect. This isn't perfect. This has to be perfect. And I said, can I have both the stones? And he said, well, what do you want the one that's not right for? I said, it's right enough for most people, but mm-hmm. that it's not right enough for you is the story. That's the story that kids need to understand. Mm-hmm. So he gave me the two stones. Those two stones, they're in beautiful boxes that were made by Steve Dion. That's his son holding the red there.
Yeah.
They were held.
And I think that red is from a wagon, because I have a recollection that these stones have traveled, haven't they?
That's right. We took these stones to Washington, D.C. with us.
Where in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, we went to Arlington National Cemetery to go with Morrill Worcester, mm-hmm. Who at the time was placing wreaths in Arlington National Cemetery. Morrill makes Christmas wreaths, and there's Morrill.
He's in the tan vest and the yellow shirt, so we have a nice profile of him.
That's Morrill.
On the left-hand side.
Morrill, that's me with my conehead hat on.
blue
right
coat,
of me,
dark cap.
Yeah, to the right of me is Superintendent John Metzler, the superintendent of the cemetery, who grew up on that cemetery as a young boy and was with his dad when they picked out the site for JFK's tomb.
Was his father the superintendent prior to him?
Not prior to him, but a couple of before him.
Oh, okay.
But when he was a kid, he grew up on that cemetery, and he tells a story. He told the story to the kids about Bobby Kennedy coming to the cemetery and meeting his dad and saying he wanted to pick out a place for his brother, John, to be buried. And they went out looking around the cemetery, and John Metzler said that his father sent him back to the house to get his jacket. It was colder than he expected. And he tells the story of running down the hill to where JFK's tomb eventually was, while his dad is explaining to Bobby, this would be the spot that I'd pick. And for me, the story for the kids with John Metzler was, imagine that. You're a little kid, you grew up on this cemetery, and you see your father treated with reverence. And 25 years later, you manage to put yourself in the position of having that job. You don't inherit that job. Your father doesn't give you that job. It's not his business. You work your way into that job. And the way I met John Metzler, Morrill Worcester is bringing wreaths down to Arlington National Cemetery. And I invite him to come to my aviation museum because my museum was a celebration of what I called ordinary people who did extraordinary things. And I asked Morrill to come to my museum and introduce him to kids because I viewed him as an ordinary person that was doing extraordinary things. And when I got to know him, I realized that Morrill's story was, as a kid, he had been to Arlington National Cemetery. He had won a field trip. He won a trip as a Bangor Daily News paper boy. And when I started going to the cemetery, David was able to provide me this photograph. Morrill's in this picture, along with Senator Margaret Chase Smith and other Bangor Daily News paper boys. And like, to me, to be able to say to kids, here's a guy who goes to the cemetery as a kid and vows to himself someday. Morrill responds with wonderment and awe when he goes to the cemetery and vows to himself that someday he will give something back to the cemetery, which he does. He goes and he starts bringing wreaths to the cemetery. And I called Morrill up and I said, I love his story. Morrill starts doing trips to Arlington with one truck of wreaths in 1992, the same year that I start doing my thing in my backyard with my museum. Mm-hmm. And eventually I invite Morrill to come to my backyard and tell his story. And when I called Morrill, it was great. I explained to him what I wanted to do. And I've talked more in the last 20 minutes than Morrill usually talks in a week. And when I invited Morrill to come, he said, I'll come. He said, but don't you waste my time. And I said, well, I'll try not to. And he came and he spent the day with me at my museum at what I call Lindbergh Crate Day. Mm-hmm. And when the event got all over, I said to Morrill, how'd we do? And Morrill turned to me and he said, this is really great. He said, if there's ever anything I can do for you, you let me know. To which my wife was standing there and she turned to Morrill and she said, well, that's a big mistake because he's certainly going to come up with something for you to do. Mm-hmm. So I said to Morrill, can I come to the cemetery with you? And he said, sure, but we come during the school year. And we come during school time. And I said, well, that's not going to work for me. And then I said, well, can I bring my class? And he said, yeah, you can work for me. You can come with me. Mm-hmm. So I went to the district and I got permission to bring my class. And in 2003, we started going to the cemetery. And we went to the cemetery in 2003. In 2004, we went back to the cemetery. And when we got to the cemetery, usually what we would do was follow the truckload of wreaths into the cemetery. It was at a time when the cemetery was still having funerals. It was during the week. And it was one truck of wreaths coming from Maine. And we would follow the truck through. And we were supposed to, the truck was going one way and we were supposed to follow somebody else in a car. And they got driving through the cemetery. And in my opinion, they were driving way too fast. Mm-hmm. And my bus driver said, I don't want to drive that fast. I said, don't you drive that fast. You just let them go. I know where we're going. Mm-hmm. And we're driving along and all of a sudden, this black Crown Vic with the license plate number ANC1 pulls in front of us and blocks the road. Mm-hmm. And I say, ANC1, I know who this is going to be. I knew John Metzler's story. I had researched him. Mm-hmm. And I got out of the bus. I said to the driver, let me off the bus. And I got out of the bus and I walked up to the car and the window comes down in the car and it's John Metzler. And he says, "Who the hell are you and what are you doing in my cemetery with that bus?"
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Superintendent Metzler, I know the cemetery means more to you than anything in the world. And I'm here with this guy putting the wreaths on. And believe me, I know where I'm doing. I know where I'm going. And you're never going to see me for the rest of the day." And he says, "I better not. Now go do what you're doing." And that's it. We go and we do what we do. 3 hours later, Morrill comes up to me and he says, "Larry, I want you to meet somebody." And we're up at the mast of the main, putting a wreath on up there. And he brings me up to John Metzler and he says, "John, I want to introduce you to a great guy." And Metzler looks at me and says, "Oh, we've already met." But then Metzler became a friend
Mm-hmm.
and became somebody that every year that we went, he came and told the story about growing up there. And the little girl in the front in the purple jacket, she has a little black notebook.
Yep.
All the kids would have notebooks and they'd be writing down things that they heard. And I would encourage them to get people's signature and match that signature to a story.
Mm-hmm.
And another person I want to point out in this photo is over at the far right. There's a guy taking a picture. And that's Richard Sassaman, a dear friend of mine who I met when I first got my museum that we'll talk about later. But Richard was a writer for Smithsonian Air and Space magazine and was a person like yourself that we make this connection and the connection goes on and on. And so, this is a very significant picture. This is a picture where, for me, Morrill comes here and here's the stories being told to these kids. And he values it because it's his story.
Mm-hmm.
It's what happened to him as a child.
He had the chance to go to Washington, D.C. as a young person. Yeah.
Yeah, go down there and meet Senator Smith and meet people and see how the world really worked and see that you can have an opportunity to have an impact on it.
Mm-hmm.
So Morrill loved that the kids were coming down there. Well, on this day, you can see there's a little white snowfall on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
It was the first time I had been there when we had a snowfall.
Mm-hmm.
And it was supposed to, it began snowing even more that day.
Yeah.
And some photographs got taken. We were over in a section of the cemetery with this is an old section of the cemetery. These are all Civil War stones. Arlington is just has such an interesting history. Arlington was the home of Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee married a Custis who was a stepson of George Washington. And when Harold Meigs, who I believe was the quartermaster of the Union Army, they decided that they needed a cemetery, and Meigs picked Arlington, Lee's mansion, which overlooks the city of Washington. It's in Arlington, Virginia. But he picks Lee's mansion, and he plants the first Union dead in Lee's Rose Garden. And it's a classic story of, I guess, the in your face kind of thinking that people have at times.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this photograph, this day, there was the snow on the stones made a photograph that got taken by an Air Force public affairs officer that went on the internet. And all of a sudden, Morrill's quiet little event, when we were down there that day, there were maybe 75 people there.
Mm-hmm.
Last year, there were over 70,000 people at Arlington.
Yeah.
And Morrill went from bringing one truckload of wreaths down to covering the entire cemetery. And Morrill eventually started a nonprofit organization referred to now as Wreaths Across America, whose mission is to remember the fallen, honor those who served, and teach our children the values of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to say to these kids that you're the teach, and remember, honor, teach.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, that's a perfect place to wrap up our first session. And I think we've given people a taste for what a remarkable storyteller you are. And this is less than the tip of the iceberg of the stories that you have to tell. So we're going to sign off, and we'll come back, and we're going to pick up more about these bus trips that you went on.
Okay.
The destination heading south was Arlington, but there's a lot of places you would stop on the way down, and there were more places that you would stop on the way back. So that's what we'll cover next. And I want to thank you for taking the time to meet with us, and we'll be back soon with part 2 of our interview.